Our final speaker is an Australian Army officer, the former commander of the 2nd Battalion Battle Group, and the former Director General Land Operations G3 of the Australian Army, and the Deputy Commanding General of the United States Army Pacific. It is my pleasure to introduce Major General Chris Smith.
Hey, thanks for the introduction. Just sort of looking out to make sure that we've still got an audience here on the last day. I'll say first, Pat, thanks for inviting me out here. It's been terrific. As somebody who comes into the US Army, you know, from a strong peer group developed over 30 years in my own army, and to not have one here, to come here and meet all the division commanders and others has been terrific, you know. So it's been good, and I feel, as a consequence of coming here early in the tenure, to feel much more welcome into the US Army. For those who don't know, this is not my first time over here. This is my third posting to the US. I did your Commander General Staff College and SAMS about, 12 or 13 years ago, and also did a small window of time in the Pentagon a couple of years ago. But what I'm not thanking you for is that I'm the last speaker, of course, for the forum. I'm the foreigner too, and I speak on a day that we've heard from 3 4-stars, including General Flynn in the last. So I hope I can manage to at least live up partially to the standard that they've set. And also I might point out that I'm talking at a time that potentially within hours the Russians might invade Ukraine, and much of what I'm about to say might prove false within a matter of hours, so we'll get to see it. But before anybody tunes out, what I hope to do today is I'm going to make a case for something, make it interesting. I'll disagree with a few speakers of this week. I'll throw a little bit of controversy on the table just to make it interesting, and hopefully as a consequence we'll get to some good discussion about the future of manoeuvre, land forces in the Pacific, and warfare generally. I think the best way to do it will be by discussing some of the features of the debate in Australia about a future war in the Indo-Pacific and its implication for land forces. And while I'm going to do my best to talk about it from the perspective of an ally, which was my brief, I don't think I can avoid linking my observations to the debate that I think is also taking place here. And I don't think I can avoid discussions about the relative utility of land forces, which General Flynn touched on then, particularly utility of land forces in the Indo-Pacific. So that said, allow me to quickly summarise the features of the debate in Australia to set it up. And if I could just ask you to change to the next slide, please. So at the risk of oversimplifying, many of the pundits in Australia imagine future warfare as battles of long-range strike coupled with ubiquitous sensors, and so much of the discussion this week has been about that particular point. But of course supported by operations in the electromagnetic spectrum, in space and in cyberspace. So think, using the language of this week, kill chains and kill webs, and think warfare by planes, ships, satellites, radars, cyber warriors and MDTFs. At its most sophisticated, the pundits also imagine these systems operating together within advanced digital network, governed by some advanced brain, artificial intelligence, with the particular aim to link the optimal sensor to the optimal available effector, so as to attack the optimal target for the optimal effect. That's the grand vision. It's the grand vision here. I think, what do you call it, JDAC C2 or whatever it is, and equivalent sorts of things back in Australia. John Antle called it the battlefield Internet of Things, I think, but it's a future war largely of targeting and long-range strike. It's neat, technical, distant and inhuman. Given this vision of future warfare, recent decisions by the Australian federal government have come in for a great deal of criticism, and General Flynn spoke about some of them. If I could just ask for the next slide, please. Those decisions include acquiring 75 M1A2 SCP version 3 main battle tanks. We're getting another 6 M88A2s to add to our existing fleet. 29 assault breacher vehicles, 17 joint assault breach systems, and 30 K9 self-propelled howitzers. And there's also a pending decision to acquire something in the order of 450 IFVs either the Rheinmetall Puma or the Korean K-10. I go through all of that, notwithstanding also we're going to reinvest in Black Hawks after a failed experiment with European helicopters and Apache. It represents a complete renewal of Australia's modest conventional warfare land capability. And it means the Australian Army is getting heavier in response to the contemporary challenges in the Indo-Pacific, not lighter. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. Now, those against modernising the Army in this way believe the money would be better spent on more missiles, on B-21 bombers, drones, and on more submarines, or potentially more land-based long-range strike missiles, including anti-ship missiles, which Australia is also looking to acquire, and we're also part of the PRISM program. In the critics' minds, there's no role in future war or for forces designed for ground combat. They believe the Army is really only useful for stability operations in the near region, something like we did 20 years ago in the East Timor and the Solomon Islands. So why is this so? Why do so many pundits take the view that future warfare in the region is largely about long-range strike, that it's maritime, and why do they take the view that land forces are largely irrelevant to future warfare in the Indo-Pacific? I think it's in part because of 5 bad assumptions or premises about warfare and future warfare, which the critics all seem to share. The first one is a tendency to conflate battle and war, which is something, by the way, that I think we've done through some of our discussions this week, I think. Second is that the discussion about future wars is largely free of context. The third, which is related to the first two, is that we all tend to overestimate the capacity of our imaginations, and we're all probably rather ignorant of the limitations of our capacity to think what the next war or future warfare will be like. Fourth, and it's a corollary of the previous three, is a tendency to take quite a superficial view of the effect of new and emerging technologies. And the fifth, the critics seem to buy into a dogma that even to the extent that land forces might be useful in the Pacific, the geography demands light forces rather than heavy ones. So I'm going to look to expand on these 5 features of the debate in the hope that it yields some important thoughts for some discussion. And I particularly hope to open a discussion about the value of manoeuvre in the Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. Let's begin with the first flaw in thinking about future warfare. It's to mistake the first engagement or battle of the next war for war itself. Now, I've seen a little bit of this tendency from speakers this week. General Funk spoke strongly about the importance of winning the first battle of the next war. John Antle spoke about the criticality of the first strike advantage to winning that first battle. And he, in particular, spoke about the tempo of war, which I think he mistook really for the tempo of battle. I think that's an important difference, and I'll touch on it later. Matt Cansdale spoke of the importance of the first battle yesterday. Ian spoke just a moment ago from a Chinese perspective about their view of the criticality or the decisiveness of victory in the first battle. And we've heard a couple of officers recently in a Army-to-Army staff talks between HQDA and the Australian Army headquarters last year. A senior American officer suggested that it was essential that both armies win the first battle of the next war. So it's a common thing. And that's just Army officers speaking about it. I understand that certainly in the Royal Australian Navy that view is much more strongly held. Now, while I don't doubt that winning the first battle is better than losing it, this conflation of war and battle underpins many of the contributions to debate, which I think is folly. And I think it's folly because I think it causes the debate to tend to focus on the limited challenge of winning the first battle rather than the broader challenge of winning a war. Quite different things. And therefore it causes us to focus on tactics rather than campaigns. And to the extent that the Australian pundits imagine what the first battle will be like, they tend to imagine a great exchange of missiles, principally over the ocean. Now, those that believe that the first battle will decide the next war tend to emphasise the lack of endurance or resilience of one side while overemphasising the endurance of the other. And I think that that's a mistake. And I'll talk in a moment about a historical example. Now, this belief in the importance of quick victory has been a common belief among many war planners in the last couple of 100 years. The belief of a quick war was common amongst the intelligentsia in Europe in the years prior to the First World War. It was a factor in the United States' decision to invade Iraq in 2003. And of course, Japan's hope that it would force the United States out of the Pacific War in 1941 by a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor derived from similar thinking. And for example, while Admiral Yamamoto, who of course led the attack, was strongly of the view that Japan should do its best to decide the fate of the war on that very first day, he privately held reservations well before the Pearl Harbor attack, believing that the idea was conceived in desperation, which it proved to be so. The key thing here is, of course, and this goes to much of the discussion, it was premised on the wishful thinking that the United States, with a reputation to that point for waging war until unconditional surrender, would simply accept the annihilation of a considerable portion of its maritime forces in the Pacific in a single attack and accept the loss of all of its power in Asia. That's the sort of thing that we need to keep in mind when we make this point. Of course, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on the back of similar thinking. So with all that in mind, it's hard to imagine a context in which the first battle would resolve much at all, particularly a battle fought only at sea. What happens after the missile salvos are done, after tons of shipping and wreckage of planes lie on the bottom of the ocean? Regardless of who wins or loses this imagined battle at sea, what will have been resolved? What aim of policy will either side have achieved? Because of course, destruction of things is only a means to an end, and therein lies the problem. It provides an excuse for us to avoid thinking about what happens after the initial engagement ends. It allows us to avoid the difficult business of considering the enormous and costly logistical challenge of sustaining a war over multiple months or weeks and months in the Indo-Pacific. It allows us to avoid the strat lift challenges General Abrams mentioned this morning. We can avoid the uncomfortable thinking about what those second, third and fourth battles might be like. Will there be a counterattack? How costly will the attack be in lives and material? What are the consequences for the security of the homeland? And what are the consequences for things like commercial shipping and trade under threat from submarines? It's just a small selection. But I think it has deeper implications too. If one imagines that the next war will be decided in the first battle, thinking about conventional deterrence becomes thinking about just winning the first battle rather than establishing the means to last and endure a campaign. And that assumes that our enemy thinks the same way and will therefore make an assessment. If we can't win the first battle, then I'm deterred. And I'm not sure that that's a valid assessment. What if the adversary is prepared to lose the first battle, absorb the cost and fight again, somewhat as the United States did after 1941? I think the other, of course, important thing leading to the next point is it allows thinkers to discount warfare on land because it's much easier to imagine the first war in the Pacific being a maritime battle rather than a land battle. Next slide, please. So moving to the second folly, when someone is describing their vision of the first engagement in the next war, it's often difficult to know what circumstance the person making the observation has in mind. Are they talking about a particular potential contingency such as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or some missile exchange in the South China Sea? Are they talking about some unanticipated future war fought over something unforeseen or unimagined? And I think we had an example a moment ago. What of a proxy civil war in Asia in which Chinese and American Australian interests clash? Or are they talking about the relative merits and utility of certain forces for peacetime competition in another country or deterrence? So in other words, without an agreed context, any argument about something in the future is valid and people can pursue their biases somewhat unchallenged. But more importantly, perhaps without a clear sense of a policy aim or the matter to be resolved, which is often only emerges as the crisis emerges, thinking about war without context tends to boil down to quantifiable things such as assessment of the relative effects of weapon systems. And so I think you end up with pundits making rather strong assertions about warfare in the next war that are quite reasonable on face value, but fail to grasp that these assertions don't hold up for all sorts of circumstances because circumstances matter decisively. Next slide, please. Now, the public contributions of a number of defence analysts in Australia, including Marcus Hellier and Hugh White, tend to follow this line. They ask the question, why engage in close combat when you can simply destroy your enemy from a standoff distance? Admittedly, Hugh White's assessment is not entirely without context. He's one of the group that believes Australia shouldn't be using armed force unless it's in direct defence of the continent. But I think this type of thinking forgets that technological advances in the 20th century that were expected to diminish the importance of close combat did not. For example, the rapid modernisation of artillery and machine guns prior to the First World War didn't negate the requirement for infantry to close with the enemy and engage in primitive close-quarter fighting. Neither did the long-range bomber before the Second World War, much to the disappointment of the air power theorists. And I'll touch again on this line of thinking shortly. But before then, I'll quickly move to the third folly. It's closely related to the last one and leads quickly into the next. It's that many of us lack, I think, a sense of humility about the inadequacies of our imaginations to comprehend what a future war might look like. And that is despite the fact that we all know we have a sorry record for predicting future war and warfare. Next slide, please. This chart is just a short example of a few predictions or wishful thinking. I think another fascinating example comes from an article from General Jim Eisenhower's hometown newspaper in Iowa, written on the 27th of February 1941, addressing the likelihood of the local 34th Division participating in the Second World War. The paper said, "World War II is a battle of airplanes and naval units. No one expects the United States infantry to leave the borders of the nation, even if this country should get involved in the war." And the 34th Division, you're probably more aware of this than I do, would go on to see 517 days in combat in the war, a number surpassed only by the 32nd Division, I understand. And Jim, of course, is the commander of the 1st MDTF. Now, the problem with this tendency to be so sure about the features of a future war and future warfare is perhaps an unwillingness by some to entertain alternative views about future potentials. And given the limits of our imaginations and given our poor record of predicting future warfare, I think it makes sense that we ought to be circumspect. Next slide. Now that brings us to a discussion of the fourth folly, and I hope to get into some meaty stuff here. I'm at risk of being accused of hypocrisy, having just said that it's bad to be predicting what future wars look like. I'm now going to go, in some ways, to give a thesis for what it might be like. But my aim is modest. I'm not suggesting that it will be like this, but merely to illustrate that an advanced and long-range strike complex, the thing that's sort of dominated our thinking for the last week, might have far-reaching and counterintuitive and more complex consequences on warfare than what we've discussed. So this fourth folly is that the limits of our imagination perhaps causes us to think rather superficially about the effects of new and emerging technologies on warfare. The pundits don't seem to consider how armed forces might adapt in response to the new technologies. Think, for example, how the mix of technologies unleashed in the First World War resulted in the stabilised front. Now, the stabilised front was unexpected. It was contrary to the aims of all involved. Everybody wanted a quick end to the war. And of course, we all know it took 3 years of fighting, countless experiments and the loss of millions of lives to restore movement to the battlefield. To that end, those that hope technology will preclude a long and bloody war in the near future puts them in the company of people like Giulio Douhet and any number of air power theorists of the 20th century. Speedy and relatively bloodless victory in war through sophisticated targeting and long-range strike complexes and kill webs is likely to prove just as elusive as all previous attempts, as General Abrams said this morning. And in fact, new emerging technologies might, like those of the First World War, just as easily contribute to a new form of long and bloody war of attrition. Next slide, please. As we've already discussed, missiles, sensors and other things now that we call multi-domain capabilities dominate the contemporary thinking, but it's not the whole picture. I think that not just in Australia, but internationally, the focus has been too much on the systems themselves and their immediate superficial consequence rather than how they will affect warfare in combination. Now, these preferences are understandable. Long-range precision missiles and those sensors give the defender the potential to create killing zones of enormous scale, crossing both sea and land. Next slide, please. And we've seen how in the eastern Ukraine and in the example earlier this week of Nagorno-Karabakh, of how the density of modern sensors and strike systems might mean in the future that they could become resilient against long-range precision counterstrikes and other methods of neutralisation. Therefore, tactics that once allowed an attacker to manoeuvre in the face of firing close with the enemy might become too expensive and uncertain to attempt. A lodgement on a shore protected by an enemy armed with a sophisticated kill web might be all but impossible without incurring decisive losses of people and machines. And we can't assume that we can simply take down the system as a precondition for the next operational phase, which has been our tendency to think for at least the last 3 or 4 decades. Now that might be a good thing in Australia's case if you believe with Hugh White and all you need to do is to set up and use your defence to deter or to destroy forces that might be coming to invade. That's a good thing. But Australia's policy, like that of the United States and many other like-minded countries, recognises that collective security and prosperity are directly affected by events well beyond our collective shores and well beyond our maritime and land approaches. So if these new age strike complexes do favour the defender so decisively, perhaps the most difficult and important challenge for us all is working out how to manoeuvre in the face of an adversary's anti-access envelope while it still functions. And I don't think we've really got to that point much this week. How do you restore the balance in warfare between the defender and the attacker back to a neutral setting? One way, of course, and this is where I'm going out on a limb and inviting some criticism, one way is to seize the initiative and hold the key terrain from the outset. And while that's largely a question of national agreements for access and basing, it's an important consideration, but possessing key terrain preemptively might, of course, not be possible. So developing ways to penetrate and manoeuvre within an enemy's area denial envelope might be necessary. Now, I think, again, the experience of the First World War suggests that those same ideas that overcame the defensive anti-access envelope then, the no man's land of the Western Front, can be reconceptualised in ways that might restore the equilibrium between defence and offence now, perhaps. For example, as John Antle suggested on Tuesday, novel ways of employing decoys, electronic warfare and cyber might assist in crossing that envelope to immobilise parts of it. I think potentially large numbers of inexpensive but protected small craft, both vehicles and watercraft, mixed with large numbers of autonomous decoys with common signatures, might be necessary to cover a vast no man's land and get enough troops across to carry the day at close quarters. The aim being quite simply to absorb enough of the enemy's fire and still get enough troops across to get decision in the close fight where it will still occur. Therefore, I agree with those like General McKean, who said this week that the next war will likely be an age-old question of mass. And perhaps as the Chinese copy the United States with large and exquisite platforms that are ripe for missile attack, now might be the time to change to an approach, and of course a number of people have expressed this in other forums. And now's the time to change to the small, many, autonomous and cheap as a way of dealing with this mathematical problem of getting enough troops across these huge, dangerous open spaces. Next slide, please. I think Matt Cansdale made a good point yesterday. I think he observed something along the lines of that the lessons of the Second World War were present in the 1930s, if only people bothered to look. The effect of advanced kill webs and kill chains on tactics, I think, is already there if we look. And I think it's been there for some time, from the former Yugoslavia to Gaza, Grozny, Mosul. Weaker and less advanced adversaries sought the cover of difficult terrain. So forces subject to advanced strike complexes, if you include what the West has been able to impose in some of these places, tend to hide in features such as cities, mountains, caves, tunnels, jungles to avoid the firepower and detection of their more powerful opponents. So when a force fails to take those precautions, results can be devastating. We saw some of those on the video in Nagorno-Karabakh earlier this week. We know what they were like in the Donbass, and I had a photo of that just a moment ago. Advanced strike complexes of modern armed forces seem to have simply forced warfare into more tight and more complex places. It suggests that the large battles in open spaces, including the sea and air, might become or might have already become decisively one-sided, and they might therefore become increasingly rare. On the contrary, battles in close and complex terrain might become the norm if they aren't so already. And some land forces, such as, of course, ISIS, recognised the danger of the open and adjusted their tactics to minimise the risk to their operations that many of us have experienced. We all know in the early stages they raced across Iraq and Syria in large convoys of Hiluxes. Of course, by the end of the war, we saw a series of attacks to recapture cities to move them out of northern Iraq. The close terrain afforded by cities offers a more neutral setting, as Laura Yeager pointed out on Monday. Next slide, please. So if the examples from the small wars of the last 30 years are anything to go by, land warfare, if not warfare broadly, might now resemble the island hopping campaign in the Western Pacific of the Second World War, and as an analogy. Close terrain is perhaps akin to the islands from which the Japanese established their fortresses. Open terrain is like the oceans between, except now the oceans or the open spaces are far more dangerous places to be and where troops are most vulnerable. It's no surprise, therefore, that fighting to recapture territory from ISIS in Iraq was characterised by a series of battles for cities and towns. Now, to that end, I wonder whether specialisation, with some exceptions, might be the wrong path. I wonder whether the same force now needs to be able to cross the large expanse of open space quickly under armour, but also fight a combined arms battle to break into the next fortified complex off the line of march, and having broken in, be able to break down and fight effectively in the tight spaces of the fortifications and urban streets and buildings in small combined teams. What Pat says, the infantry tank team as an exemplar. And to sustain the fight, the force will need to get a steady stream of supplies from the last safe place, the last city or fortification, to the next across an open space covered by the advanced strike complex and potentially roving swarms of UAVs. I suspect that this is the future challenge, and I wonder whether we ought to be working out how to solve these particular problems. I know in Australia, for example, we've turned to the mining industry to see how we can work out how to move supplies over distance autonomously without a person involved, from lessons of autonomous movement of iron ore and so on. Next slide, please. But I also think the First World War metaphor is more broadly useful when thinking about employing precision weapons. It's not just a land warfare metaphor. And just as the US Army, the Marine Corps, the Australian Army seized islands and coastal airstrips to advance air forces through the Pacific in the Second World War, so too land forces might be necessary to project and defend long-range strike capabilities in the future. In other words, as John Richardson observed yesterday, land forces in some circumstances serve to seize and hold locations from which long-range strike is made possible. Now, I think this is an important idea because the range of land-based systems or emerging land-based systems makes the sea a very vulnerable place to be indeed. It is, in effect, no man's land. And I imagine with those ranges, the South China Sea in particular is a no man's land. Control of the sea, and control of the land, will be important in control of the sea. General Abrams pointed out, control of a strait is best achieved by control of the surrounding land, and I think the Dardanelles campaign of the First World War proved that point. As they say, a ship's a fool to fight a fort. So to use that World War I analogy again, just as riflemen served primarily to protect machine guns, which were the primary killing systems in the First World War, land forces might in future also serve to protect and enable precision strike at long range in much the same way. And so to bring these ideas and threads together, it's likely that in a future war in the Indo-Pacific involving precision weapons, Cities, towns, and other complex terrain and fortifications in the littoral might become the metaphorical machine gun nests for precision strike, which will be defended by ground troops. Next slide, please. Now, these ideas for the time being are just a raw thesis. You can take it apart, and that was the intention, to invite some discussion. And I reckon the live experiment that's about to take place in the coming days or weeks in the Ukraine might reveal whether there's any validity to it. It might prove that make a fool of me, but we'll get to see. But I also think that it's a useful idea because I think it might bring different communities together. It's a joint and it's a multi-domain problem, and it involves the land force. Navies can't sort of exclude us from the discussion, and I think navies need to start taking the threat of land-based systems and their vulnerability at sea more seriously, and I think it's a solution that we all have to work on together. Now that brings me to the fifth and last folly, which is a little bit of an outlier, but I think it's worth discussing. I'm going to discuss it briefly in the interests of time, but I quickly want to maybe challenge some orthodoxy that the challenge of warfare in the Pacific is a light force, ground force challenge, if it is a land force challenge at all. I'm just going to make 5 quick observations only, then I'm going to bring things to a quick close. Next slide, please. The first observation is simply to point out the heaviness of Asian armies. Many regional armies possess large numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles. I encourage you to take a look at the armies of Southeast Asia and see for yourself. They, understanding their own geography, understand that that type of capability is relevant and useful. It's worth also pointing out that tanks were used extensively in the Second World War in the Pacific by the United States Army, the Marine Corps and the Australian Army. And a report by the Australian Defence Science and Technology Group back about 20 years ago to justify our first initial purchase of the M1A1 Abrams, looking at tanks in support of Australian infantry attacks on NVA and VC bunker systems in Vietnam, found that the result of those attacks was always a victory for the attacker. The number of Australian casualties was markedly less by a number of 50%, I think, or greater. The number of enemy casualties was an even greater percentage higher. And tanks were more decisive than artillery and close air support in those contacts. And I have the report if anybody's interested. And it's worth pointing out that the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 involved hundreds of tanks on both sides. Now, the second observation is to simply point out that tanks were invented. I'm a light infantryman, by the way. There's some element that feels reluctant to talk about this. It's a good point to make. The second observation is to point out that tanks were invented in the First World War to overcome the mud and obstacles of the Western Front. This notion that the rice paddies and the other challenges of the jungle in the Pacific is somehow works against the utility of armoured vehicles, I think is also folly for that reason. I think the next point to make is that the islands and land masses in Asia are not too small for large-scale manoeuvre. The sort of the mainland Southeast Asia is in the similar order of size as Europe, and yet we don't regard Europe as a maritime theatre. Nagorno-Karabakh is roughly the same size as East Timor, for example. The Donbass is smaller than Taiwan by 4,000 square kilometres. It took 2 armies and 6 corps to seize Manila in 1944-45. Okinawa, which is just 900 square kilometres in size, took 500,000 troops to seize, including 250,000 combat troops against 76,000 fortified Japanese. So I think you get my drift. And the last observation I'll make is to question the assumption that heavy forces are too difficult to deploy in the region. Now, while there is some truth to that, rather than throw our hands in the air and wring our hands, I think we ought to perhaps be looking at working out how to resolve that problem rather than simply suggesting that the solution is light forces, because the risk is they won't be able to carry the day. So there you go. I'm going to bring things to an abrupt end there. I hope that I've offered something of interest and some chaff to throw into the mix for some questions and discussions. being the last speaker, I suspect the last thing people want to do is ask some questions, but I'll answer a couple for those that are interested. Thank you very much.
Sir, I'll ask the first question. So more of a statement than a question, sir. So I think probably in a lot of American military minds, the Battle of France looms large. A lightning campaign that won perhaps a campaign, but resulted in the loss of a war and disarmament for 80 years. So, but that model is very powerful for us. I think I've seen it several times in this. So I think, I just would like your opinion, it's not just our view on the Pacific, but our view over warfare potentially in general, because this seems to be very similar to effects-based operations, net-centric warfare, all of these things that we've come before in our experience. Do you have any comments on that, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that even to the extent that there is a tendency to look at the European theatre, I think we tend to cherry pick bits of it that we like. North Africa is a clear example. It's neat. You know, it's the type of manoeuvre that we'd all love to be involved in. You can envelop and you can penetrate and so on. I think we tend to look at the Eastern Front in Europe as another wonderful case study, and you're quite right. We look at what Guderian did sort of in northern France to end that quite quickly. But of course, that's only a very small piece of that particular theatre. As the Russians closed in on the Germans at the end of the war, and that terrain got much closer, it turned into a very different war. But we don't tend to reflect on that challenge. We don't look at the lessons learned of the Germans in the defence and the challenges of the Soviet Union and even the challenges of their own doctrine at that point to deal with a particular problem. So yeah, look, I agree. I do get the sense, and I agree with you too, even through this week, I get the sense here that there is a bias to look east and to look towards Europe. I get the sense that even, to look west into Asia is less a thing. And interestingly, I visited the Infantry Museum a couple of days ago, and I should have taken it down. There was a quote in there from, I think, a Medal of Honor winner who'd returned back to the United States. I think he'd earned his Medal of Honor in New Guinea or the Philippines, where most of the US Army fighting was in the Pacific. And he sort of said that he felt like a poor man in relation to everybody else because the whole national spirit was interested in what was happening in Europe, not what was happening in the Pacific. And to the extent that the Pacific was of interest, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's somewhat more, it's your history, the Marine Corps and the island hopping campaign got a great deal more coverage than the hard slog that was the northern New Guinea and the Philippines, notwithstanding MacArthur's gravitas.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, sir. We get a mic down here.
Your comments on the first battle.
I absolutely loved your comments on the first battle, and I guess I'd ask you to take them a little farther and help us understand how ground forces can help with this understanding of resilience in the face of it. Because I think that's something that we don't talk about enough of, right? You can sink a ship, you can shoot down a plane, you don't do either to a brigade or a division, right? And so how do we send that message? Because I think the way you laid it out was really powerful. I always get to talk about how Red thinks about it, but again, it's resilience in the face of it that matters. And I think you're kind of onto something. So I'd be really interested to hear you flesh it out a little more.
No, look, I agree. I've got an adequate answer because this goes to the point of context. It's hard to know what the particular thing will look like, and much of it's a function of policy. If you just took a general view of Taiwan, and we need to be careful because we can't get into op plans and so on. But you just took a layman's view of Taiwan, and if countries like the United States or Australia took a policy position in the face of potential aggression of China that might be different, in a future time, there's a couple of ways to deal with that problem. One of which is, if you want to defend it, it's a land battle. The matter is a land thing, you could extend it to any future example where a country might choose to seize something. I think, while there might be a preliminary phase to set conditions at the sea and air, I can't imagine any purpose by an opponent that would require us to respond won't have some land objective. That's probably the point. And then when you imagine that, you realise it's very unlikely then that whatever happens at that point will be decisive quickly, and therefore you have to be prepared to last. I think, sorry, I'm going to move off slightly, but you just reminded me of something. We spoke earlier in the week about fait accomplis. If an adversary is interested in a fait accomplis in the Pacific, if you don't have the capacity to challenge it, that is, that they establish a fait accompli, see something quickly, the only way to respond is to take it back. If you have no capacity to manoeuvre in the envelope, cross the envelope, and then have the forces and sufficient force to get inside and take it back, I would imagine in the calculus of that country, fait accomplis look much easier. I think that's worth asking. Sorry, that's slightly off your point, but I apologise. I know I didn't answer it adequately, but this is part of the challenge and why I stressed it's a context-free zone, it depends. My point would be we can't know precisely the circumstance. It's hard to imagine a useful policy objective that has no land bit of it, and if you're going to think about that, you've got to think about being able to last. That's probably the point.
Sir, I have a question. To apply your model to Nagorno-Karabakh, as we discussed, Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, we have heard discussion that the drone with the precision munition won the war, but if we flip it, the drone with precision mission set the conditions for the light infantry and the special forces to clear the trench lines and take the territory. Is that like what do you have to say about that, sir?
Yes, I think so. I think, though, I don't like it. I question its usefulness as a case study, only because it to some extent, it just says the Armenians learned nothing from watching 30 years of other wars of a similar kind. Don't sit out in the open, you will just be destroyed piecemeal. And I get the sense from that's exactly what happened. So to some extent, I don't imagine that that we will see that. I think the clearance will be through the bottom floors and second floors and underground bits of buildings in places where the autonomous vehicle is hard to get in and might not be able to get in. I see that. I suppose my broader point was to say that this strike and surveillance architecture is a challenge for getting enough forces into the close fight, but the close fight will be much the same as it was. I can imagine a role to play for little autonomous vehicles to go and look around a corner or go into a tunnel for reconnaissance, but it's still going to take an infantryman and an engineer, and with the assistance of a tank and intimate support, to go and clear that out. And if I'm not mistaken, not that I have any personal experience, and you can correct me, but this is what our Iraqi friends were largely doing with our support through Mosul and other places. I think that's an indicator of what the next thing will look like.
Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.